evening. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll go ahead and get started now. It's a little bit after 7. My name is Rosie Hartwell, and on behalf of the DC Who's, again, thank you for joining us, especially after our date change. So we appreciate your patience there, but we're really excited to get into tonight's event. I am one of the chairs for the DC Club Speakers and Panels Committee, so we are so excited to welcome two great speakers tonight for this discussion on the history of women at UVA. A little bit about me and our club. I am a graduate of the college, the class of 2019, and we have over 10 different committees with the DC Who's putting on various social events and dedicated events to culture and the arts and sports as well. So we have something for everyone. We definitely encourage you all to check us out if you haven't already done so. But without further ado, we'll get into tonight's discussion, and I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers for this evening. Our first speaker is Professor Emerita Phyllis Leffler. She retired from the History Department of UVA in 2015. Her research focused on the history of UVA with a spotlight on the experience of women. She led a survey of women who attended the university prior to full coeducation in 1970. She also founded the Institute of Public Policy, placing undergrads and grads in various internships. She currently is the president and chair of the Albemarle Civil Historic Society, Charlottesville Civil Historic Society. So thank you so much, Phyllis, for being here with us tonight. Our second presenter is Richard Gard. He is the Alumni Association's VP of Communications and editor of the Virginia Magazine. He joined the magazine in 2016, and since then, the magazine has won over 30 journalistic honors, including one for the piece he will discuss tonight, Not Without a Fight. Richard was an Eccles Scholar while he was at UVA, and he was an English major. He earned his law degree at the University of Georgia and started his career in investigative journalism, law, and business. So thank you, Richard, for being with us tonight. We are so excited to hear from you both. I will go ahead and now turn it over to Phyllis, who will be speaking first, and she will be sharing some of her research with us tonight. So please, Phyllis, take it away.
Hello, can you all see me, or am I not visible?
We can see you, Phyllis.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to be here to talk about the history of women at UVA. I've spent a lot of my career researching this topic, and it's always such a pleasure to share it. So I think I will start out by sharing my screen with my PowerPoint presentation, and we'll take it from there. So let me just see if this is going to work. I think it is, so that's good. So my talk tonight is focused on the history of women at UVA. I want to take you on a short journey into the past, and I want to pose the question to you, is the past also present? And in what ways might that be the case? It often doesn't seem so on the surface, but I'm wondering to what extent some of the values of the early university linger on into the current. So I want to ask 3 questions tonight. I want to ask, and hopefully answer for you, when did women come to the university? Secondly, was there controversy over their coming? And finally, what does this tell us about institutional values? So I want to start with a bold assertion. And my assertion is that from the inception of the university until about 1970, and perhaps beyond, there was a fight for gender recognition and a fight for gender equality at the university. 1970 is remembered as the year when women entered the College of Arts and Sciences on a non-exceptional basis with men, And we know that that decision fundamentally changed the university. Most people say for the better. I would say for the better. But very few people know that before then, more than 15,000 women earned professional, graduate, and undergraduate degrees, and an equal or greater number earned diplomas or certificates in various educational subjects. So why is it that we remember 1970? And to this day, I hear people talking about 1970 as the year that changed the university in terms of admitting women. Why is it that we don't remember those earlier years and give women who came during those years the recognition that they deserve? And I would submit to you that this goes back to the very foundations of the university, to the very values that Jefferson himself established when he created the university in 1825. Who was this university for? Jefferson said that the university would be a training ground for the future leaders of our new Republican experiment, of the new United States. And from the beginning, the university had a Southern aristocratic flavor. In this context, in this place, there really was no place for women who, in Jefferson's view, inhabited a different sphere from men. Jefferson believed that women should be educated, but they should be educated in what he called the amusements or ornaments of life. Things like dancing and drawing and music. He believed women should develop their capacities and their excellence as domestic caregivers. Women lived in a different sphere, and excellence was to be defined domestically. The university, from its beginning, was associated with words like genteel, aristocratic, elitist, chivalric, honorable, and gentlemanly. And I would suggest that those concepts and words continued for a very, very long time. Change came slowly to the South. There continued to be a kind of Victorian ideology of separate spheres for women. And in the post-Civil War period, the lost cause mentality venerated and continued to venerate both racial and gender hierarchies. So 1970 is remembered as the time when women entered on a fully coeducational basis. But I want to focus tonight on some significant dates. I want to look back to the 1880s. I want to talk very quickly about an aberration that happened between 1892 and 1894. I want to talk about 1901 as a turning point that will be specifically focused on nursing education. I want to talk about the period of the 1920s and the period leading up to the 1920s when women were admitted, but in a very, very restricted capacity. And then I'm going to jump to the 1960s and 70s, say just a couple of words about that, and turn it over to my colleague, Richard. So let's begin with the period of the 1880s. The 1880s, women were allowed to come to the university in what were called summer session programs. Very important here is that these were not degree granting programs. And there were a number of different renditions of these programs. So in the 1880s, there were summer institutes for teachers. And in the first program, there were 500 students that came, 312 of them were women. And then, as I said, there were a variety of renditions. In 1901, there was the Summer School of Methods. In 1906, an actual summer session for teachers. By the 1910s, there were up to 1,500 women on grounds during the summer session. And some of the faculty were actually male faculty from UVA. Others came from other places across the country. It's interesting to note that one of those teachers for one summer session was Georgia O'Keeffe, who lived in Charlottesville locally at the time and had been a student herself and then was brought on to the faculty. But the very important thing to remember is that these were not degree granting programs. Women could take classes. Sometimes they could get credit for them, sometimes not, but they could not apply them toward a UVA degree. By the 1910s, there were so many women on grounds at the university that the numbers were often larger than the regular male students that were matriculating during the year. But again, they were not considered bona fide UVA students. And just to give you an example that just to show you that there in fact were women here, we have a couple of photographs that remain from the time. These are photographs of women in home economics classes during the summer session. And one of my favorite slides ever, I hope there's laughter out there, is of women in an agricultural program with the male faculty member demonstrating some things about this cow, we don't know what, and the women very carefully taking notes, looking very serious, and trying to learn whatever lesson is being taught here. So 1880s through and up to 1920, women are here in the summer. They're not getting any real recognition or recognized as being in any kind of diploma or certificate or degree granting program from the university. I want to talk very quickly about this little aberration that I said exists in the 1890s. There are two women that we know of who wanted very much to matriculate during the regular year. One was Carolyn Preston Davis, who was the daughter of a faculty member at UVA. In 1892, she wants to get a degree in mathematics. Well, she's not allowed to be a student in regular classes, but she can be tutored separately. And that's what happened. She was tutored separately. She sat, as they say, for a certificate in proficiency in math, and she received that certificate. And then in 1894, along came Addis Mead, who wanted to do a master's degree in math. She did the same process of working separately with private tutors. She sat for the exam. She passed the exam. The Board of Visitors then took up the case and decided that no more women would be allowed to do this anymore. It's like one was okay, but once you get to two, that's a bit too many. So there is this aberration in the 1890s. And then the next step that I want to talk about starts around 1901 with nursing programs. Now, there were women at the university who enter as early as 1901, not in summer sessions, but in regular programs. And the creation of the nursing programs is specifically focused on serving the needs of doctors. The University of Virginia created a hospital in 1901, and there was a need for the doctors to have nursing support. So there were nursing programs created. They were not considered academic programs. Some of them offered certificates, some of them offered diplomas, but not academic degrees. So in 1901, 3 students enter. By the 1920s to 1930s, there were between 90 and 130 students in such programs. In 1926, there's a graduate nursing education program in the School of Education, not in the college where the graduate nurses wanted to be, because it was too controversial for it to be put in the college. And I must say that the women graduate students raised the money themselves for this program to be established. It is not until 1949 that there's a Bachelor of Science in Nursing created under the School of Medicine that's approved by the School of Medicine, not until 1951 that the first students enroll. So from 1900 on to at least the 1950s, the nursing programs were considered, as one alumni said, a school apart. That is, they were there, they were housed in McKim Hall, which was the nursing dormitory. They saw themselves as a cohort group, but not at all connected to the rest of the university. They felt separate, they felt apart, and they were meant, I would say, to be kept apart. A couple of photos. Here's one of a class of 1919. You can see the nurses in their uniforms surrounded by their male professors, along with the superintendent of nursing at the time. And then this photo I like too. This is a 1947 photo of a graduating class of nurses. The nurses graduated in Old Cabell Hall, but they were not allowed to march or to be on the lawn along with the men. It was a completely separate event and separate ceremony. So 1880s, women in the summer institute programs, 1900 on, women in nursing. And those are, of course, considered for the time the women's professions. So the next thing I want to look at, I want to jump to the debate that brings us to the 1920s, when there was a very major change that was made in terms of women's co-education at the University of Virginia. Now, I just want to pause for a minute and talk about the debate centering on whether education should be what was called coordinate education or co-education. So coordinate education was the concept that men and women needed to have separate facilities, that they could not come together in the same classrooms because, as I said, they were considered to have different needs and to exist in separate spheres. And the idea of coordinate education was that women could share the faculty, they could share certain facilities like libraries or laboratories, but they could never be in the same classrooms together. And you can think of the notion of sister schools that developed around the country. You can think of Wellesley and Harvard. You can think of Barnard and Columbia, and numerous other schools like that. Well, at UVA, there were women who were pushing this idea that the university should be open to women. They were taxpayers. They wanted to have access to the university. There was a legislative debate that raged from 1910 on, right up to 1920, over the establishment of a coordinate educational system. And there was two legislators, Early and Risen, who submitted a bill in the legislature every 2 years to establish the funding to create coordinate education at UVA. And the bill came up every 2 years, and it failed every 2 years. In 1920, a decision was made not to establish coordinate education, but co-education on a very, very limited scale. So I will get to that point and tell you about it. But I do want to make sure I say that the idea of a coordinate college did not die. And it was not until 1944 that such a coordinate college was created, when Mary Washington College became the sister school to the University of Virginia. Now notice that unlike Wellesley and Harvard, or Barnard and Columbia, that are just across the street from one another, Mary Washington College is 70 miles away in Fredericksburg, Virginia. So what kind of a coordinate school was that? But in any way, that was the debate. And the debate, as I said, faltered and failed. And so I want to ask you, I want you to come along with me as I talk to you about what some of those forces were that were resisting this notion of coordinate education and what was behind that. So I asked the question, why? Why was it so hard to get this concept started? So first, I want to talk about the legislature. The legislature was filled with UVA alumni. After all, Jefferson said this was to train the statesmen for the future. And many of them had ended up going into politics and were in the legislature, were not eager to see their beloved institution changed in any way. Second, as time went on, university priorities often shifted. So that, for example, in 1913, Edwin Alderman, the president of the university, who was in favor of admitting women on some basis, discovered that he really needed funding for a larger medical school to be established here in Charlottesville, and he needed legislative approval. So he couldn't alienate alumni. Then there was the rector and the board of visitors who were not behind this idea. World War I intervened, which was a problem, so it no longer seemed like you could really push the issue of women in the middle of a wartime period. Student opinion was against it, and I'm going to talk to you about that, show you an example of that in just a minute. Faculty opinion was against it. And then the southernness of the university raised its head. And finally, the University of Virginia president, Edwin Alderman, who had been in favor of this, came to feel that it was not going to be a good idea. So let me quickly go through some of these objections. So first of all, let me talk about this student petition. No, I'm sorry. Gosh, I need to go back. Hold on just a second. I want to talk about a student petition from 1918. And I'm going to read the statement on this. At the moment, my screen is not allowing me to see the full one, but hopefully I can. Yeah, here we go. We believe that there is at the University of Virginia as a priceless heritage of 98 years of splendid history, an atmosphere and spirit which fosters manhood and those other things which go to make men of honor and character. And we further believe that this peculiar force, a result of masculine ideals, which has distinguished our university from other state universities, will be destroyed by introducing at our university either coeducation or coordination. Second, faculty opinion. Richard Dabney, the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. Believing profoundly that men and women are not only physically, but mentally, spiritually, and socially different, I utterly reject the idea that the two sexes ought to be educated in exactly the same way. But on the grounds of expediency, I'm willing to make some concessions to a false idea in order to escape the revolutionizing of this thoroughly masculine university. In 1916, the New York Times Magazine published an article, Will Jefferson's University admit women? Notice that this had now reached national significance. And again, the New York Times writer, who was not defined, talks very specifically about these Southern traditions and writes, to the North and West, this seems little enough to ask. To the Old Dominion, the idea is revolutionary. And again, to the chivalric idea of the conservative South, coeducation is an impossible thing. women must be kept apart, unspoiled by worldliness and intimacy. And finally, coming back to this aristocratic idea, there is a due desire for intellectual aristocracy. Edwin Alderman, president of the university, who really had worked closely to try to work toward coordination, in 1918 changed his mind. And in a College Topics article, he wrote, "Coeducation would be a profound mistake at an institution whose personality was masculine." So I want to just very quickly talk a little bit about Mary Munford. Mary Munford was one of the major lobbyists in support of trying to get coordination passed. She was very interested in her goal that she called a politics of equality. She was herself from a very genteel Southern background. She didn't marry until she was 38 years old, but she married a man who was very progressive in his thinking, who died very young, who was a legislator, and she picked up the mantle and continued to work on the issue. She became the first woman on William and Mary's Board of Visitors. She ended up on UVA's Board of Visitors from 1926 to 1938, and she created all kinds of organizations to support this fight and effort. She was in regular communication with Edwin Alderman, the president of the university. Now, Edwin Alderman becomes president in 1905, and when he became president, he created the Curry School of Education because he was a firm believer, as he said, in building a college for the training of teachers. So of all people, you would expect Edwin Alderman to support this. And he had supported it when he was president previously at the University of North Carolina. But the climate at UVA just seemed to be very different, and he came to believe he could no longer support it. Nonetheless, in 1920, the Board of Visitors does decide to admit women to professional and graduate programs. They needed to be at least 20 years old. They were eligible to enroll in what was called vocational degrees if they'd had 2 years of college elsewhere, and they were not eligible for arts and sciences. So in 1920, white women enter in the field of law, medicine, architecture, education, and graduate arts and sciences. In 1920, when this started, there were 23 women. In 1926, there were 118 women, and it grew from there. And so there were several hundred women on grounds earning degrees in graduate programs. And also, we could talk about this in the question and answer if you're interested, but also felt very, very sidelined in their education, although we should remember that they were here. And the situation remained that way largely up until the 1960s. But I want to show you how in 1920 there continued to be sentiment against this. 1920, College Topics, the precursor to the Cavalier Daily. The time has come for the university to surrender before the conquering forces of equal rights for all, that ancient absurdity against its will. The aristocrat among American colleges has had to stoop to mingle with the common herd. And then just a little cartoon that I like to share. This came out in Corks and Curls in 1920. There you have women in their hats, as male students often were expected to wear hats, standing before the statue of Thomas Jefferson saying, "We'll have to replace it with a statue of Mrs. Jefferson." Tongue in cheek, of course, but I think that there is a message underlying that. Trying to push and toss Mr. Jefferson himself off of his pedestal. So as I said, it's really not until the 60s that the next phase of education is one that is being challenged in terms of leading up to full coeducation. I'm going to in just a moment let Richard take it from here. But before I do that, I just want to point out something about the sentiment on grounds of the university and how some of the attitudes and values in the period leading up to the first limited coeducation carried on throughout the 1960s. So again, why? Why did it take so long? And I want to talk about the ideas of faculty, and I want to mention here Julian Bishko, a very distinguished faculty member in history. He'd been on the faculty for 39 years, and he wrote in 1969, "Should we not seek here at Virginia to maintain the college's predominantly masculine character as essential to preserving our traditions and fulfilling our founders' intention toward us?" Faculty sentiment was against it. Alumni sentiment was against it, very concerned about the honor system, very concerned that somehow men whose duty it was still seen as the duty of protecting women would be able to turn women in for honors offenses. Alumni thought the honor system would die if you allowed women to enter the university. Students were opposed to it. They didn't want to see their university change. Cavalier Daily article, "Women have no honor, only deception." And finally, a report from the Honor Committee in 1969. "Our principal and final conclusion is that it is not in the best interests of the honor system to make the University of Virginia coeducational." So I think some of the same attitudes, the aristocratic heritage, the honor system, the masculinity, the maleness of the university persist right up until 1970. So I just want to end with this final photograph of Edgar Shannon and his wife. Edgar Shannon comes in 1959. He has a profound effect on the university. It's Edgar Shannon who our library is now going to be renamed for him. And I think that's myself a very good decision. And I would say he has a major role in taking the university to its next and much more modern stage. So thank you for listening. I'm going to leave it here and turn it over to my colleague, Richard Gard.
Yeah, thank you, Phyllis. You covered a lot of ground, and I'm going to take it from here, assuming I share my screen with you. All right, sorry about that. All right, this was a really interesting story for us, and sort of something of a treasure hunt, because the conventional history of the litigation over coeducation, which is what I'm going to be talking about, is that UVA, the Board of Visitors, had already voted in favor of coeducation, that a lawsuit brought by the ACLU was something of a sideshow, basically a nuisance suit, because UVA had already voted in favor of coeducation. As we dug into it, which meant reconstructing the court record of this case, we found that wasn't exactly true. In fact, the opposite was true. And so I want to go into that a little bit. And I'm going to start, Phyllis just showed you a picture of Edgar Shannon. I'm going to show you this one as well, because it was Edgar Shannon who got the ball rolling back in April of 1967, when he sought Board of Visitors' permission to pursue coeducation. And you'll see, and I'll try, and I promise you, I'm going to pick up the pace with my slides. But it's a seemingly slow process. And so as I was putting this story together, one question I had was, how invested was Edgar Shannon in coeducating the university? And the answer I got from people who knew him and who were there at the time said, you better believe he was invested in it. One, he was the father of 5 daughters, pictured here. He was also the husband of Eleanor. So he was all in for coeducation. He also had to navigate a very conservative board and a lot of that history that Phyllis just reviewed with you. So in April of '67, he went to the board seeking to pursue coeducation. And they said, well, first, we need you to demonstrate to us, quote unquote, whether there is even a need, whether there's a need for this. And that begot this amazing document, the Woody Report. Braxton Woody was this old school, old U professor here at UVA, had gone to UVA, was known for giving the honor orientations in the old university hall, the old basketball arena, and basically where he would, with fire and brimstone, scare the daylights out of people about lying, cheating, or stealing. But the Woody Report was a very thorough going of the question of coeducation, and it came back with a very persuasive and comprehensive case in favor of coeducation. It really sort of walked through the arguments, and it's worth reading if you are interested in further pursuing this topic. And a lot of it had to do with culture here. The fact that it was a male university meant that there was a lot of binge drinking and a lot of binge drinking and driving as the men went down the road to the women's colleges. And it was just, in a lot of ways, a toxic environment as documented in the Woody Report. It also included a faculty survey, and this may contradict something that Phyllis said, but actually the faculty, something like 90% of faculty were in favor of coeducation, at least by this time, by around 1967 they were, for a lot of reasons having to do with culture and having to do with just sort of the academic level and rigor of UVA. And then he also laid out, he sort of took one by one the reasons against coeducation. A lot of this idea of what Phyllis was describing as the character of UVA, and that was a running theme, that you can't have coeducation because it's just going to change the character of the institution. And they also, in the Woody Report, provided a roadmap of cases of people who are unfairly affected by the fact that UVA is male only. Phyllis mentioned about Mary Washington, the sister school, being 70 miles away, and the Woody Report talks about the unfairness of somebody who's in Charlottesville, fully qualified to go to UVA, but is forced to drive 70 miles away. And that becomes very important in the litigation that would follow. So the first major character in this story is Edgar Shannon and his role in getting the ball rolling. And so he came back with the Woody Report and said, yeah, there really is a need, and here's a very persuasive and strong case for it. The Board of Visitors came back to him and said, well, not so fast. We need a second study, a feasibility study. And that was turned over to Frank Hereford, then the provost, and would later become the president of the university. If you see this picture, if they look awkward in this photo of them shaking hands, there's probably a reason. Two individuals could not be more different. I don't know that they had the greatest of relationships. Shannon was very cerebral, didn't go to UVA, but he was a Rhodes Scholar, an eminent scholar in the humanities, very urbane. Hereford was from Louisiana. He's a triple who. He was a physicist. He was a no-nonsense scientist. And nobody's idea of a progressive. So the ball is given to Hereford, and he, in very quick fashion, comes up with, okay, a feasibility plan. If we're going to have coeducation, how are we going to implement it? And the Hereford plan called for these conditions, which would become really critical in the lawsuit that would follow. The first condition is that, sure, will be co-ed, but women cannot take the slots from male applicants. They can be additive only. They can't affect male applicants' chances of getting into UVA. Number two, we can't accept so many women as to undercut admissions for Mary Washington, our sister school, for which we have corporate responsibility. So even if UVA has room for women, we're not going to accept all of them because we don't want to hurt Mary Washington. Three, we're going to phase this plan in over 10 years. The arguments about because we have to retrofit facilities to accommodate women. that becomes pretty comical. You'll see in a slide coming up. And so when it was all put together, the Hereford plan would have coeducated UVA in 10 years, but only to the extent where the college would be 35% female and the university itself only 29%. It is a really difficult, it's a plan that's difficult to explain, hard to defend. And when push came to shove and witnesses came to testify, namely Frank Hereford, it would make for a really, really uncomfortable moment in a court proceeding. So the Board of Visitors on February 15th, 1969, they approved the Hereford plan. And with that, they then assert, going forward, there, we've done it. We've approved coeducation. Well, meanwhile, while they're patting themselves on the back for for adopting the Hereford plan, wheels are turning in what would become a federal lawsuit against the university. And it starts when Ginger Scott, who is at this point a freshman at William and Mary, drops out during her first semester there, her fall semester. Her mother has died. She's a Charlottesville resident. So Ginger comes back to Charlottesville a bit at sea, and so interviews for a job. And she happens to interview with John Lowe, the gentleman pictured here. But she interviews with a very young John Lowe, 2 years out of UVA Law School. And in the course of the interview, she tells them that, yes, she's looking for work and she's really interested in working for his law firm, but she's going to need to go back to school, so she may have to leave her job. And Lowe says, oh, well, you just go to UVA. It's right here in our backyard. And she says to him, well, actually, no, UVA does not accept women. And he is absolutely astounded by that. Lowe went to UVA Law, but did not go here undergrad and didn't realize that we were single-sex undergrad or that it wouldn't admit women. And so his answer to her was, first of all, you've got to be kidding me. And secondly, well, we may have to do something about that. Lowe then gets the ACLU on board to sue the university for gender discrimination. And they pair him up with Phil Hirschkopf, who at the time was, and still a very prominent lawyer. He was one of the winning lawyers in the Loving v. Virginia case a few years before this that did away with Virginia's laws against interracial marriage, a seminal US Supreme Court case. So they then set up the litigation, and part of that is to have Ginger go in for an admissions interview with Ernie Earn, who was then the Dean of Admissions. He would later become the Vice President for Student Affairs. And as in the course of reporting this, I was able to find his handwritten notes from that interview. And during it, he has a lovely interview with Ginger, and he explains to her that she seems eminently qualified, but the university doesn't accept women. But he tells her some of her options, including maybe you could take some community college classes nearby. So, and then she responds by giving him his options, which are, you can admit me, or my boss is going to sue you, along with the ACLU. It's included in Ernie's notes. Ernie, by the way, who was in favor of coeducation, duly noted this in the file. And then 2 months later, sure enough, John Lowe and Phil Hirschkopf, with Ginger as one of the plaintiffs, file suit in federal court in Richmond. And there's a strategic reason they file it in Richmond, which I don't need to get into here. And then the following month, June of '69, there's a wonderful scene where John gives Ginger the opportunity to go serve process on the president of the university and the Board of Visitors and everybody else. And she does that by going to her high school friend, who happens to live in Pavilion 2 with her parents, including Edwin Floyd, then a math professor. So the two of them go strolling up and down the lawn colonnade. The university's offices were then in Pavilion 8 to serve process on the university muckety mucks. And so we're off to the races with the lawsuit. It's a really interesting time in this area of the law because Brown v. Board, of course, was decided about 15 years earlier. That's the one that a school segregation case where the Supreme Court said that separate but equal is not allowed. The ACLU wanted to apply that to male-only UVA, that separate sex is not equal. UVA countered by saying, no, Brown only applies to racial discrimination cases, not gender discrimination, and argued for a much more forgiving standard called rational relation, again, which we don't need to get into. The Supreme Court would later land in the middle of those two standards, but it would take several more years and a young Ruth Bader Ginsburg, pictured here, to develop that area of the law, which became known as the Equal Protection Revolution. In the meantime, the court in Richmond dealing with this had no appetite for a test case. So then things go to trial. And on the morning of, or a hearing actually, and on the morning of the hearing, the judges put all the parties in, or the lawyers at least, in chambers and say, you need to settle this case. And they put heavy pressure to settle it. We know this because Phil Hirschkopf was kind enough to share some of his notes from the time with me. He kept a journal of all of these events. And getting nowhere in the settlement negotiation, the judges agreed to have a hearing that afternoon, but they really steamrollered it. They really made it run fast. Lowe and his team, Lowe and Hirschkopf, were able to make really fast work of the little time that they had. And one of the star witnesses is pictured here. It's Kate Millett, a feminist from the time, who did this study of the 7 sister schools to the Ivy League schools, which Phyllis referenced just a little while ago. And she did a similar study of Mary Washington and just found it to be just that it was appalling to hold up Mary Washington as an equal education as that someone would be able to get at the University of Virginia. There was a lot of testimony about the university needing 10 years to be able to convert the place to accommodate women, with an almost obsession with what they would have to do with the dorm bathroom facilities. When John Lowe questioned her about this on the stand, her suggestion, as you see on the slide, was, well, perhaps they could put flowers, they could plant flowers in the urinals. Phil Hirschkopf told me that the transcript doesn't do it justice, that Millett was also Oxford educated, as was, and that the sort of British clip in her voice just had everybody in the courtroom howling. Hereford took the stand to try and explain the ins and outs of his overcomplicated plan, his 10-year phase-in plan that only would accomplish 29% coeducation. And it was a disaster for reasons I don't need to go into here, but it's in the story that we wrote if you have the opportunity. The judges came back the following day and ruled immediately. And they basically said, UVA, you've got 30 days to come up with a plan that meets our approval, or else. And that or else is, we're going to apply Brown versus Board, separate but equal, to UVA and hold that you cannot have separate education for men and women. You have to have coeducation. So 3 days later, the Board of Visitors met in Pavilion 8, and they agreed. They scrapped the Hereford plan. They committed to a 2-year phase-in of coeducation. And that then set coeducation in motion. There was a follow-up hearing where Ginger Scott and the lawyers tried to have a bigger recovery than they were allowed. They wanted class certification for all the people who've been discriminated against, not just Ginger and her 3 co-plaintiffs, but the whole class of women who have been denied a UVA education. The court said no. They wanted the court, as a matter of principle, to apply Brown versus Board to gender cases. The court again said no. And they said, you should award us damages for the trouble we went to get this result. And the court again said no. So fall of 1970 is when the college admitted its first class of women, but with a cap, a numerical cap. And then by fall of 1972, they lifted the cap and admitted women on the same basis as men. So there's my speed read of the litigation that forced coeducation and forced UVA to embrace coeducation a lot more fully and a lot faster than they had originally planned. And I guess we'll take questions now if we have them.
Great. Well, thank you both, Richard and Phyllis, for your presentations. I know I learned a lot from that, so I hope the audience did too. But we are able to take some questions. We had some pre-submitted questions, so I can go ahead and start us off with those. One of them focused on comparing UVA's timeline of admitting women to other universities, specifically Georgetown. So we wanted to know if you could speak to any timelines you know of in terms of who got there first.
I can offer this, that we basically got there last. The University of Virginia was the last public university to coeducate other than the military academies. That would take another lawsuit, one that went all the way to the Supreme Court involving VMI. Even the Ivy Leagues had coeducated, the private Ivy League schools had coeducated before UVA, though not too far before us.
And I would like to add, because I do think it's important in some ways to the UVA story, that William and Mary made the decision to co-educate its student body in 1918. And part of the pressure to admit women on a limited coeducational basis in 1920 was really based on William and Mary's prior decision, because UVA wanted to be able to get funds from the legislature, and that was one way to do it, would be to expand their class, their student body in this more limited way, following in a very limited way the example of William and Mary, who had gone the whole way in 1918. And I'll also add that that many universities had jumped in much before UVA did. So, for example, Oberlin, founded in 1853, they admitted women, 1833, admitted women as early as 1837. Midwestern universities admitted women. The University of Chicago opened in 1892. 40% of its student body was made up of women students. And if we look at Southern universities, University of Arkansas admitted its first women in 1872. University of Mississippi, 1882. Alabama, 1892. And 1897, as I'd already said, UNC admitting graduate students while Alderman was president. So there is something here that I think, we really need to ponder as to why UVA was as late as it was. And I think both of us tried to suggest some of the pressures that tried to mitigate against it, and maintaining the maleness of UVA was a very significant part of that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both for that input. And I see, Phyllis, that you shared some of the resources of both you and Richard into the chat. So if anyone would like to take a closer look at anything we discussed tonight, those resources are available to you all. I did see earlier we had one hand raise. Rebecca.
And also I see a question asking why the case was filed in Richmond, which I can answer. It had to do with Judge Marriage, if I'm pronouncing that right, who was in Richmond. The plaintiffs made a point to include the governor of Virginia, as well as some other state officials, as defendants. That then gave them a venue in Richmond where they had a sympathetic ear in Judge Marriage. He would be the judge who also brought about school desegregation. Which was, so it was very helpful to them. They ended up with a 3-judge panel because at the time they were challenging the Constitution, and that was the process then. The other 2 judges were maybe a little bit less sympathetic, but it helped them along procedurally in the case.
Great. And then our last question, can we just, I guess, to end, what challenges are we facing in the current times, and what's the path forward?
So
Kind of a big question.
yeah, I think that's a question for some of the people on the program to really ponder themselves. I think there's been tremendous change. It's been incremental since the 1970s. I did have something in my presentation that I didn't have time to get to, in which I had some material on women who were firsts. And of course, the university has seen its first woman president with Teresa Sullivan, the very first person in that role, who we know had many challenges of her own as president. And then so many of the deans now at UVA are women. So I think there's been a real administrative shift. But I also want to point out that on the Board of Visitors, there are currently 18 members, if we exclude the non-voting members. 4 of those people are women. So in a university where the majority of students, both graduate and undergraduate, are now women, having 4 out of 18 members of the Board of Visitors be women is not exactly, an equal number. So I think one of the major ways to grow institutionally is to continue to bring more women into leadership positions.
Absolutely. Richard, any final thoughts?
Sure. I'm going to take this question from Rebecca about the furniture. There was just this absurd testimony in the case where Frank Rogers, who was then the rector of the board, was saying that, before we can have women come here, we're going to have to buy furniture for women. It's going to have to be diminutive furniture, and we have to buy, I kid you not, ironing boards. So at the hearing on this with Kate Millett, again, this feminist who made the cover of Time magazine, John Lowe put it to her. He said to her, would you like to comment on the need for diminutive furniture? And she said, is it even worthy of a comment? And he said, well, I think it is. And she said, oh, diminutive furniture like kindergarten furniture? And that was the testimony. And they just sort of let that lie out there for the judges to hear. It was, I got to talk to Ernie Earn. Again, he was that admissions dean who sat in on this hearing, who said it was just, he called her a hurricane when she came through that court and testified. So that was the reference to kindergarten furniture.
Something new every day. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I want to thank our presenters, Richard and Phyllis, for your expertise and giving us some of your time. Thank you so much. And to the Office of Engagement for helping us facilitate the technology for tonight. We appreciate that too. And then thank you to everyone else who attended. So we want to always, if you're looking for something to do, the TC Who's has a newsletter, and we have events going on all the time. If you want to take a look here and take out your phone for the QR codes, the UVA Club of Washington, D.C., and then the UVA clubs in general. I have Instagrams, Facebooks, and websites for you guys to look at to see what's coming up in your area. So we, again, thank you for your time, and we hope you enjoyed tonight's presentation. Thank you.